The spring rains had turned Main Street into a river of mud, and Helena Jarrett lost her footing on the third step down from the Mercantile, her arms windmilling uselessly as she plunged forward into the thick, cold mire that swallowed her up to her elbows. Columbia, California. In 1868 was a town built on gold dreams and stubborn determination, but compassion seemed to be in short supply that particular April morning. Helena pushed herself up onto her knees, her cream-colored dress now a sodden brown mess, mud dripping from her hands and sleeves. People walked past on the wooden boardwalk, their eyes sliding away from her predicament as if acknowledging her would somehow obligate them to help. A woman in a green bonnet actually stepped around her outstretched hand, lifting her skirts higher to avoid contamination. Two miners laughed as they passed, making jokes about city girls who couldn't handle a little dirt. Humiliation burned hot in Helena's chest, mixing with the cold shock of the mud that had splashed across her bodice and face. She tried to stand, but her boots had no purchase in the slick mess, and she went down again, this time landing hard on her hip. The pain shot through her leg, and worse than the physical discomfort was the sting of being so thoroughly ignored by every soul who witnessed her struggle. "Easy now." The voice came from behind her, deep and calm as a mountain lake. Before Helena could turn her head, strong hands gripped her beneath her arms and lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child's doll. She found herself on her feet, steadied by those same hands until her legs stopped shaking. Helena looked up into a face that seemed carved from the same granite that made up the Sierra Nevada themselves. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the weak morning sun. His hair, dark brown with hints of auburn where the light caught it, fell past his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a hunting knife when it got too long. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but couldn't hide the strong jaw beneath. His eyes were the color of pine forests, green with flecks of brown, and they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his overwhelming physical presence. "Let me see your hands," he said, and it wasn't quite a command. But Helena found herself extending her mud-caked hands toward him anyway. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, clean and surprisingly white, and began to wipe the mud from her fingers with a care that made her throat tight. His own hands were massive, calloused from hard work, with scars across the knuckles that spoke of a life lived rough. But his touch was gentle as he cleaned each of her fingers, turning her hands this way and that to make sure he'd gotten all the grit out of the creases. "Thank you," Helena managed, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I thought I was going to be stuck there until the mud dried. Folks in town can be too busy for their own good sometimes." He finished with her hands and moved the handkerchief to her face, wiping a streak of mud from her cheek with the same careful attention. "You hurt anywhere besides your pride?" "My hip," she admitted, "but I'll be fine." He studied her face for a long moment, those forest green eyes seeming to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "You're new to Columbia." It wasn't a question, but Helena nodded anyway. "I arrived 2 days ago on the stage from Sacramento. I'm looking for work as a teacher. The town posted a notice that they needed someone for the school." "Fletcher James," he said, offering his hand. When she placed her still damp palm in his, he shook it with the same gentleness he'd used to clean it. "I live up in the mountains, but I come down to town for supplies every few weeks." Helena Jarrett. She felt the heat of a blush creeping up her neck as she realized she was still holding his hand. She let go quickly, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear and succeeding only in smearing more mud there. "I don't suppose you know where I might find the head of the school board?" Fletcher gestured toward the building across the street. "Marcus Whitman runs the assay office there. He's the one who handles school business too, but you might want to clean up first." He said it kindly, without judgment, and Helena looked down at her ruined dress with a sinking feeling. "I'm staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house," she said, "but I had an appointment to meet with Mr. Whitman this morning, and I'm already late." "He can wait another hour." A man who wouldn't understand why a lady needs time to make herself presentable after taking a tumble in the mud isn't worth working for anyway. Fletcher picked up the small basket she'd dropped when she fell, which had somehow remained upright, its contents of bread and cheese miraculously intact. "Come on, I'll walk you back to Mrs. Chen's and make sure you get there without any more accidents." Helena wanted to protest that she could manage on her own, but the truth was her hip was starting to throb in earnest, and the idea of Fletcher's solid presence beside her was more comforting than she wanted to admit. They made their way down the street, Helena acutely aware of the stares they were drawing. She must look absolutely ridiculous, covered in mud, and being escorted by a mountain man who looked like he'd stepped out of a penny dreadful novel. Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, met them at the door of her boarding house. She took one look at Helena and launched into a rapid stream of Cantonese that needed no translation. Fletcher set down the basket and tipped his hat to both women. "You take care of that hip," he told Helena. "Put something cold on it to keep the swelling down." "Thank you again, Mr. James. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone too quickly to name. "Most people just call me Fletcher, and I'm glad I was there." He nodded once more and turned to go, his long stride carrying him back toward Main Street. Mrs. Chen waited until he was out of earshot before she started chattering at Helena in English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "That man, he is good. Lives alone up in mountains, but good heart. Not like other men who come to town and drink and fight. You lucky he help you." Helena let herself be bustled upstairs to her small room, where Mrs. Chen helped her out of the ruined dress and brought water for washing. As she scrubbed the mud from her skin, Helena couldn't stop thinking about the careful way Fletcher had cleaned her hands, the concern in his eyes when he'd asked if she was hurt. In the 3 years since her father died and left her with nothing but debts, she'd learned to rely on herself. Men who offered help usually wanted something in return. But Fletcher had asked for nothing, expected nothing. He'd simply helped because she needed it. An hour later, wearing her only other good dress, a modest gray cotton with black trim, Helena made her way to the assay office. Her hip still ached, but Mrs. Chen had given her a cold compress and some willow bark tea, and the pain had settled to a dull throb. Marcus Whitman turned out to be a middle-aged man with spectacles and a harried expression, surrounded by samples of rock and ore that covered every surface of his office. "Miss Jarrett," he said, looking up from a ledger, "I'd heard you'd arrived in town. I apologize for not calling on you sooner, but as you can see, we're in the middle of assaying several new claims." He gestured to a chair that held a stack of papers. "Just move those anywhere." Helena set the papers on the floor and sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I understand you're looking for a teacher for the school." "Desperately. Our last teacher married one of the miners and moved to San Francisco. That was 4 months ago. The children have been running wild ever since, and their parents are getting restless." He peered at her over his spectacles. "You have experience?" 2 years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, and I tutored privately for a year after that. I have letters of reference." She pulled the carefully folded papers from her reticule and handed them over. Whitman scanned them quickly, nodding. "These are excellent. The position pays $40 a month, plus use of the teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse. It's small, but it's yours rent-free as long as you teach. You'd start on Monday." $40 was more than Helena had hoped for, enough to live on and even save a little. The cottage meant she wouldn't have to continue imposing on Mrs. Chen's hospitality. "I accept," she said, trying not to sound too eager. "Good, good." Whitman stood and shook her hand. "I'll have the cottage cleaned out for you by Sunday. School runs Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. You'll have students ranging from 6 to 14, about 20 children total. Some of them are quite bright. Others are more interested in following their fathers into the mines. Your job is to teach them all to read, write, and cipher, at minimum." As Helena left the assay office, she felt lighter than she had in months. A real job, a home of her own, however small, and the chance to do work that mattered. She stopped by the mercantile to purchase a few supplies for the cottage, spending carefully from her dwindling funds. The same clerk who'd watched her fall in the mud earlier was suddenly all politeness now that she was the new schoolteacher. Over the next few days, Helena threw herself into preparing for her new position. The cottage was indeed small, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen, but it was clean and sturdy, with a view of the pine-covered hills. She scrubbed and organized, made curtains from cheap muslin, and arranged her few books on a shelf. The schoolhouse itself needed work, too. The previous teacher had left it in disarray, with broken desks and torn primers scattered about. On Saturday, Helena was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she heard the creak of wagon wheels. She looked up to see Fletcher guiding a team of horses pulling a loaded wagon. He pulled to a stop in front of the school and climbed down, moving with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. "Heard you got the teaching job," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Brought you some things you might need." Helena watched as he began unloading the wagon. There were 4 sturdy desks to replace the broken ones, a bookshelf that looked handmade, slates and chalk, and a box of primers so new the ink smell wafted up when she opened it. "Fletcher, I can't accept all this. It's too much." "Already paid for," he said, carrying 2 desks at once as though they weighed nothing. "School board should have taken care of it months ago, but they're all too busy with their own concerns. Children need proper equipment to learn." "Did you make these desks yourself?" Helena ran her hand over the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. "Had time this winter. Figured the school could use them eventually." He set them down and went back for more. "Where do you want them?" They spent the next hour arranging the schoolroom, and Helena found herself enjoying Fletcher's quiet company. He didn't fill the silence with empty chatter, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful. He told her about the families whose children would be in her class, warning her which boys were likely to cause trouble and which girls were so shy they'd need encouragement to speak up. "You know a lot about these children for someone who lives alone in the mountains," Helena observed. Fletcher shrugged. "I listen, and I've lived around here long enough to know most of the families. Some of them have been here since the gold rush started in '48. Others are newer, looking for what's left of the easy pickings." He finished positioning the last desk and turned to her. "You'll do well with them. You have a kind face but firm eyes. They'll respect that." Helena felt heat rise in her cheeks again. She seemed to blush constantly around this man. "Thank you for all of this. The desks, the books, everything. You didn't have to do it." "Wanted to," he said simply. He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's a church social tomorrow after services. Most of the town will be there. It would be a good chance for you to meet the parents before school starts on Monday." "Will you be there?" The question was out before Helena could stop it, and she wanted to bite her tongue. But Fletcher just smiled, a barely there curve of his lips beneath his beard. "I might make an appearance. Save you a piece of cake if they have any worth eating." Then he was gone, climbing back onto his wagon and heading out of town toward the mountains. The church social turned out to be exactly what Helena needed. She met parents who were grateful to have a real teacher again, children who were excited or nervous or both about starting school, and several women who seemed eager to befriend her. Mrs. Chen had insisted Helena wear her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and had helped arrange her dark hair in a style that was fashionable without being frivolous. Fletcher arrived late when the social was already in full swing. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his hair tied back and his beard neatly trimmed, wearing a clean shirt and vest that somehow made him look even larger and more imposing. Helena watched several of the unmarried women in town gravitate toward him, fluttering and giggling, but he extricated himself from their attention with polite firmness and made his way to where Helena stood, talking to the parents of 2 of her future students. "Miss Jarrett," he said, and there was something warm in his voice when he said her name. "I believe I promised to save you some cake." He had indeed found the best dessert at the social, an apple cake with cinnamon that melted on Helena's tongue. They sat together on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, watching children run and play while adults talked and laughed. It felt natural, comfortable, as though they'd known each other far longer than a few days. "Why do you live up in the mountains alone?" Helena asked, then immediately worried she'd been too forward. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "It's all right." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of jays argue over a crumb. "I came out here in '62 during the war. Didn't want any part of brothers killing brothers, so I headed west instead. Tried mining for a while, but I'm not built for grubbing in the dirt for gold that might not be there. Found I'm better with my hands, making things. And I like the quiet of the mountains, the space to think. Come down to trade furniture and whatnot for supplies, but mostly I keep to myself." "Don't you get lonely?" Helena had been lonely for so long herself that she recognized it in others. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've known people who were lonely in a crowded room." His eyes met hers. "What about you? What brought you all the way to California?" Helena told him about her father, a professor who'd loved books more than practical matters like paying bills, about his death and the debts that had consumed everything, including the small house Helena had grown up in. about her time teaching at the academy, which had ended when the headmistress's nephew needed a job and Helena was let go to make room for him. About the months of searching for work, the rejections, the slow erosion of her savings, until she'd been desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a teaching position across the country. "I had nothing left to lose," she said, "so I used the last of my money for a ticket west. If this hadn't worked out, I don't know what I would have done." Fletcher's hand covered hers where it rested on the bench between them. His palm was warm, calloused, solid. "It worked out," he said. "You're going to be a fine teacher. Those children are lucky to have you." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that made Helena's heart beat faster. She became acutely aware of everywhere their hands touched, the warmth of his shoulder near hers, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. Then, a child's ball rolled to their feet, breaking the spell, and Fletcher released her hand to toss the ball back to the waiting boy. Monday morning arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves that had Helena up before dawn. She dressed carefully, ate breakfast without tasting it, and arrived at the schoolhouse an hour early to make sure everything was perfect. The children began arriving at 7:45, some eager and scrubbed clean, others dragging their feet and looking mutinous. Helena quickly learned that teaching in Columbia was nothing like teaching at the Philadelphia Academy. Her students came from wildly different backgrounds and skill levels. 10-year-old Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, could already read better than some of Helena's 14-year-old students. The Murphy twins, 6-year-old boys with matching gap-toothed grins, had never held a pencil before. Teenage Thomas Crawford clearly didn't want to be there and made his resentment known by disrupting lessons and encouraging the younger boys to misbehave. By the end of the first week, Helena was exhausted and questioning every decision that had brought her to California. Thomas had put a frog in her desk drawer, causing chaos. 2 girls had gotten into a hair-pulling fight over a borrowed hair ribbon. And she discovered that nearly half her students needed spectacles they couldn't afford, squinting uselessly at the chalkboard from the back of the room. Friday afternoon, after she'd dismissed the children, Helena sat at her desk and let herself cry from sheer frustration. That's where Fletcher found her when he knocked on the open schoolhouse door. "Bad week?" he asked, his voice gentle. Helena wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this. They won't listen, half of them can barely read, and Thomas Crawford treats every lesson like a personal insult." Fletcher came in and sat on one of the desks he'd made, which creaked under his weight but held firm. "Tom Crawford's father beats him when he gets bad grades. Boy's afraid if he learns too well, expectations will go up and he'll never meet them. So he makes sure he fails on his own terms instead." Helena stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I pay attention. And I've seen the bruises." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "His father drinks, loses money gambling, takes it out on his son. Not much anyone can do about it directly, but you can make sure Tom knows this schoolhouse is a safe place. Stop grading him on the same scale as the others. Praise effort instead of results. Give him a reason to want to learn that has nothing to do with his father." It was good advice, practical and compassionate. Helena found herself wondering how this mountain man who lived alone had such insight into human nature. What about the others, the ones who can't see the board? "I'll make spectacles." At her surprised look, Fletcher explained, "I can grind lenses well enough for basic sight correction. Won't be perfect, but it'll be better than squinting. Give me a list of who needs them." "Fletcher, you can't just make spectacles for half a dozen children. The materials alone can and will," he said, that warm tone back in his voice. "You want your students to learn, don't you? Hard to learn what you can't see." Over the following weeks, true to his word, Fletcher provided spectacles for every child who needed them. He also became a regular visitor to the school, stopping by on his trips to town to repair broken desks, replace worn-out primers, and occasionally teach lessons himself on practical subjects like woodworking and how to read the land for weather signs. The children adored him. Even Thomas Crawford, sullen and defensive with everyone else, would soften around Fletcher, asking questions about the mountains and how to track animals. Fletcher answered with patience, treating each question as though it mattered, never talking down to the children. Helena found herself watching for Fletcher's visits, her heart lifting when she'd see his wagon coming down the road. They fell into an easy friendship, talking about books and ideas while he helped her grade papers or prepare lessons. He borrowed books from her small collection and always returned them with his thoughts written on scraps of paper tucked inside, observations that were often startlingly perceptive. Spring turned to summer, and with it came the end of the school term. Helena's students had made remarkable progress. Even Thomas Crawford, though he still pretended not to care, could now read full paragraphs and solve arithmetic problems that would have baffled him months earlier. The parents were pleased, and the school board voted unanimously to keep Helena on for another year. The last day of school, the children surprised Helena with gifts: wildflowers, a pie baked by Sarah Chen and her grandmother, a carved wooden apple from Thomas that he thrust at her with burning cheeks before running out the door. Helena packed up her classroom, feeling a sense of accomplishment she'd never experienced at the Philadelphia Academy. She'd made a difference here. These children would carry what she'd taught them forward into their lives. Fletcher was waiting outside when she locked the schoolhouse door. "Thought you might like to see where I live," he said, "if you're not too tired from wrangling children all day." Helena's pulse quickened. In all their months of friendship, Fletcher had never invited her to his home in the mountains. "I'd like that very much." They rode in his wagon up winding trails that climbed higher into the pine forests. The air grew cooler and cleaner, scented with sap and wildflowers. Fletcher pointed out landmarks, telling her stories about the land, about the Miwok people who'd lived here long before gold seekers arrived, about the bears and mountain lions that still roamed these hills. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view that stretched for miles across forested ridges. It was larger than Helena had expected, built from logs he'd cut and fitted himself, with real glass windows and a stone chimney. Inside, everything was neat and well made. Furniture he'd crafted filled the space: a large table, chairs, shelves lined with books, a bed in the corner covered with quilts in intricate patterns. "Did you make these?" Helena touched one of the quilts, admiring the workmanship. "My mother taught me to sew before she died. Said a man should know how to mend his own clothes and keep himself warm." Fletcher moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, though the summer evening was mild. Quilting helps pass the winter nights. Helena wandered the cabin, taking in details that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. Books on subjects ranging from philosophy to animal husbandry, tools hung in precise order on the walls, a violin in a corner, well used and lovingly maintained. This wasn't the home of a rough mountain man barely scraping by. This was the home of someone who'd chosen solitude but filled it with beauty and purpose. "Why did you really bring me here?" Helena asked, turning to find Fletcher watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stood, moving toward her with slow deliberation, giving her time to step away if she wanted. Helena stayed exactly where she was. When he reached her, he raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with the same gentleness he'd used to clean mud from her hands months ago. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day I pulled you out of that mud," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because you're the bravest, kindest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. Because when you're around, this cabin doesn't feel empty anymore." His eyes searched hers. "Because I'm in love with you, Helena, and I needed you to see my life, see who I am, before I asked if you might feel the same." Helena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "I do," she whispered. "Feel the same. I've been falling in love with you since you cleaned my hands and looked at me like I mattered." Fletcher's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his whole face. Then he was kissing her, and Helena rose on her toes to meet him, her arms wrapping around his neck. His beard was soft against her skin, his lips warm and gentle despite the strength in the arms that encircled her waist and pulled her close. She'd been kissed before, fumbling attempts by unsuitable suitors back in Philadelphia, but nothing had prepared her for this. For the way Fletcher kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, like she was home and he'd been lost for years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Stay for dinner. I'll take you back to town before dark, but stay a while longer." They cooked together, Fletcher producing potatoes and vegetables from his garden, venison from his smokehouse, fresh bread he'd baked that morning. Helena was charmed to discover this huge, powerful man moved around a kitchen with easy competence, chopping and stirring while telling her stories that made her laugh. They ate at his table as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Helena thought she'd never been happier. True to his word, Fletcher drove her back to Columbia before full dark, but not before kissing her again in the doorway of his cabin, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. "Can I court you properly?" he asked. "Come calling on Sundays, bring you flowers. Let the whole town know my intentions?" "Yes," Helena said, not caring that proper young ladies were supposed to be more reserved. Yes to all of it. The courtship of Helena Jarrett and Fletcher James became the talk of Columbia. Every Sunday, Fletcher would arrive in town scrubbed and dressed in his best clothes, with wildflowers in his massive hands, and escort Helena to church. Afterward, they'd walk or ride together, exploring the countryside, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He taught her to recognize animal tracks, to read the sky for weather, to appreciate the profound silence of the deep forest. She introduced him to poets he'd never read, challenged his ideas, made him laugh with her dry observations about human nature. The town's opinion was divided on their relationship. Some thought Helena was mad to consider tying herself to a man who lived miles from civilization. Others envied her for catching the attention of Fletcher James, who'd been the subject of speculation and romantic interest since he'd first arrived in California. Mrs. Chen approved wholeheartedly, declaring that Helena needed a strong man who could match her stubborn spirit. As summer deepened, Helena and Fletcher's relationship deepened with it. They stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, held hands during walks, spent long evenings on the porch of Helena's cottage, talking until the stars came out. Fletcher was endlessly patient with Helena's questions about his life, his past, his dreams for the future. She learned he'd grown up in Virginia, the youngest of 4 brothers, and that his mother had been a teacher who'd instilled in him a love of learning. His father had been a carpenter, passing on the skills that Fletcher now used to make his living. "Do you ever want to go back?" Helena asked one evening as they sat watching fireflies dance in the dusk. "No," Fletcher said without hesitation. "Virginia's my past, California's my future, or it is if you're in it." In August, Fletcher asked Helena to marry him, and she said yes before he'd even finished the question. They were at his cabin, and he'd carved her a ring from a piece of pine, delicate and perfect, with tiny wildflowers etched around the band. "I'll get you a proper gold ring," he promised, sliding the wooden one onto her finger, "soon as I can get to a jeweler who does fine work." "I don't need gold," Helena said, admiring the ring. "This is perfect because you made it for me." They married in September, in the small church in Columbia, with half the town in attendance. Helena wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Fletcher wore a suit he'd bought special for the occasion, looking uncomfortable and magnificent in equal measure. Thomas Crawford and several of Helena's other students attended, grinning and elbowing each other when Fletcher kissed his bride. The wedding celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing in the street. Fletcher proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, moving with the same grace he brought to everything physical, sweeping Helena around until she was breathless and laughing. When the festivities finally wound down, they drove up to the cabin in the mountains, to the home that was now theirs together. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, Fletcher's gentleness at odds with his size and strength, making sure Helena felt safe and cherished. Afterward, wrapped in his arms under the quilts he'd made, Helena felt a peace she'd never known. She'd found home, not in a place, but in a person. The question of Helena's teaching position was resolved when the school board agreed she could continue through the fall term, with plans to find a replacement after Christmas. Helena threw herself into her final months of teaching with renewed energy, knowing that this chapter of her life was coming to a close. She'd miss the children, miss the satisfaction of watching young minds grasp new concepts, but she was ready for the next adventure. Life at the cabin suited Helena better than she'd expected. She'd worried she might find the isolation difficult after the bustle of town life, but instead she found it liberating. She and Fletcher fell into rhythms that felt natural, working side by side. Helena helped with the garden, learned to preserve food for winter, took over the cooking while Fletcher handled the heavier outdoor work. In the evenings, they'd read aloud to each other, or Fletcher would play his violin while Helena sewed, or they'd simply talk, sharing thoughts and dreams in the firelight. Fletcher continued making furniture to sell in town, and Helena discovered she had a talent for the detailed finishing work, sanding and staining while he did the heavy construction. They made a good team, their skills complementing each other. The money from furniture sales, combined with what Helena had saved from teaching, gave them a comfortable cushion. Winter came to the mountains in earnest in November, the first snow falling in fat, lazy flakes that turned the world white and silent. Helena had never experienced a real mountain winter, and Fletcher made sure they were prepared with enough food, firewood, and supplies to last until spring if necessary. The cabin, well built and cozy, kept them warm even when storms raged outside. Those winter months were some of the happiest of Helena's life. Snowed in together, she and Fletcher existed in a world of two, learning each other's habits and moods, building a foundation of intimacy that went beyond the physical. Fletcher taught Helena to snowshoe, to identify animal tracks in fresh snow, to appreciate the stark beauty of the winter forest. Helena introduced Fletcher to authors he'd never read, started teaching him French from a book she'd brought from Philadelphia, made him laugh with her attempts to learn the violin. In February, Helena realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be certain before telling Fletcher. When she finally shared the news one morning over breakfast, he went very still, his eyes widening. A baby. His voice was rough with emotion. We're going to have a baby? In late summer, I think. August or September. Helena watched his face, trying to gauge his reaction. Fletcher stood abruptly, came around the table, and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squeaked in protest. He loosened his grip immediately, looking worried. Did I hurt you? Are you all right? Should you be sitting down? Do you need anything? Helena laughed, touched by his concern. I'm fine, Fletcher. Pregnant women don't break. I'm perfectly healthy and strong. But Fletcher still treated her like spun glass for days afterward, insisting she rest more, doing all the heavy chores himself, worrying over every little thing. Helena found it sweet and exasperating in equal measure. Eventually, she sat him down and made him talk through his fears. My mother died giving birth to my youngest brother, Fletcher admitted, his voice tight. I was 12. I watched my father fall apart, saw the baby sicken and die within a week because there was no one to nurse him properly. I'm terrified of losing you. Helena's heart broke for the boy he'd been, witnessing such tragedy. She took his face in her hands, making him look at her. I'm strong, and will get the best help available when the time comes. Mrs. Chen has delivered dozens of babies and promised to come stay with us a month before I'm due. I'm not going anywhere, Fletcher. I'm going to be fine. And so is our baby. As the winter turned to spring, Fletcher slowly relaxed, though he remained attentive to Helena's every need. He built a cradle from cherry wood, carving birds and flowers into the headboard with painstaking care. Helena sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands busy while they talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the future they were building together. In May, they made a trip to town so Helena could stock up on supplies and visit with friends. The journey was harder on her now, her belly round and swollen, making her uncomfortable on the wagon seat. But she'd missed the people of Columbia, missed the bustle and energy of town life. Mrs. Chen fussed over her, feeling her belly and pronouncing the baby strong and healthy. Several of Helena's former students came to visit, telling her about the new teacher and how much they missed her. They also ran into Thomas Crawford, now 15 and working in the mines with his father. He'd shot up in height over the winter, his shoulders broadening with hard labor. When he saw Helena and Fletcher, his face lit up in a rare smile. Miss Jarrett. Mrs. James. He blushed, looking between them. Heard you were expecting. Congratulations. Thank you, Thomas. How have you been? Helena could see fading bruises on his arms, and her heart ached for him. All right, I suppose. Working the claim with Pa. He shuffled his feet, then seemed to gather his courage. I wanted to thank you, both of you, for teaching me that learning wasn't something to be afraid of. I've been reading books in my spare time. Mr. Whitman lends them to me from his collection. Fletcher clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Proud of you, son. You keep reading, keep learning. Your father's path doesn't have to be yours. Thomas nodded, blinking hard. "Yes, sir. I remember that." He tipped his hat to Helena and hurried off before emotion could overwhelm him. "That boy's going to make something of himself," Fletcher said, watching him go, despite everything working against him. They stayed in Columbia for 3 days, visiting friends and handling business before heading back to the mountains. Helena was relieved to return to the peace of the cabin, the constant noise and activity of town exhausting her now. She spent the summer preparing for the baby, nesting in every corner of their home, while Fletcher worked on enlarging the cabin, adding a second bedroom for the child. True to her word, Mrs. Chen arrived in mid-August, accompanied by her granddaughter Sarah, now 12 and excited to help with the baby. They settled into the cabin, filling it with feminine energy and chatter that Fletcher pretended to find overwhelming but secretly enjoyed. Helena could see him hiding smiles as he listened to Mrs. Chen's stories or Sarah's enthusiastic descriptions of life in town. The baby came in early September, on a cool morning when mist clung to the valleys between the mountains. Helena's labor started just after dawn, and she spent the day walking, breathing through contractions while Mrs. Chen timed them and offered encouragement. Fletcher was beside himself with worry, pacing like a caged animal, until Mrs. Chen finally ordered him outside to chop wood or do something useful instead of making Helena nervous with his anxiety. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Helena's son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced with a surprising amount of dark hair. Mrs. Chen cleaned him and wrapped him in blankets before placing him in Helena's arms, and Helena felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible. This tiny person, this perfect combination of her and Fletcher, was theirs to love and protect. Fletcher was allowed back in once mother and baby were both cleaned and settled. He approached the bed slowly, reverently, his eyes wide as Helena pulled back the blanket to show him their son. "He's perfect," Fletcher whispered, reaching out one massive finger for the baby to grip. "He's absolutely perfect. Are you all right? How do you feel?" "Tired, happy, in love." Helena smiled up at him. "We have a son, Fletcher. They named him Francis Henry James, but from the start they called him Frank. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's green eyes and his mother's serious expression." Fletcher was completely besotted, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, holding him with infinite care despite his size, singing soft songs his own mother had sung to him. Mrs. Chen and Sarah stayed for 2 weeks, making sure Helena recovered fully and teaching both new parents the skills they'd need. When they finally returned to Columbia, Helena felt confident in her ability to care for Frank, though she knew she'd miss Mrs. Chen's wisdom and Sarah's cheerful help. The first year of Frank's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. Helena marveled at each milestone: his first smile, the first time he rolled over, the day he learned to sit up on his own. Fletcher crafted toys for his son, carved animals and blocks that Frank would grab with chubby fists and gnaw on with emerging teeth. As Frank grew from infant to toddler, Helena and Fletcher's love deepened into something richer than the passion of their early courtship. They were partners in every sense, supporting each other through the challenges of parenthood, celebrating the joys, building a life that was full and meaningful. They made trips to Columbia several times a year so Frank could socialize with other children and so they could maintain connections with friends, but they always returned to their mountain home with relief. When Frank was 2, Helena became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, her body knowing what to do. And in the spring of 1872, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Hope Catherine, and she was as different from her brother as could be. Where Frank had been serious and watchful, Hope was smiley and social from the start. She had Helena's dark hair and Fletcher's strong features, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from day one. Fletcher proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful, equally comfortable roughhousing with Frank as he was singing lullabies to Hope. He taught his children to love the mountains, taking Frank on short hikes as soon as the boy could walk, pointing out animal tracks and teaching him the names of plants. As they grew, both children followed their father around like devoted shadows, eager to help with whatever he was doing. Helena found motherhood more fulfilling than she'd expected. She missed teaching sometimes, missed the intellectual stimulation of working with bright young minds, but she poured that energy into educating her own children. By the time Frank was 4, He could already read simple words and solve basic arithmetic. Hope, not to be outdone by her brother, demanded her own lessons, and Helena would often find both children bent over slates, practicing their letters with fierce concentration. The years flowed one into another, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Frank grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and steady temperament. Hope was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. They were close siblings, playing together for hours, occasionally fighting as siblings do, but always united against the outside world. When Frank was 7 and Hope was 5, Helena became pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder, her body older now and tired from years of mountain living. Fletcher worried constantly, remembering his mother, but Helena made it through, giving birth to a second son they named Daniel Marcus. Daniel was a surprise in every way, coming 2 weeks early and arriving so quickly that Fletcher barely had time to fetch Mrs. Chen from town. He was a happy, easy baby who grew into a cheerful toddler, bringing laughter to every situation. With 3 children, the cabin felt full to bursting. Fletcher began work on a larger house, a project that would take years but that he approached with characteristic patience and care. He cut and prepared timber, stone by stone laid a foundation, while Helena managed the household and children, teaching and cooking and keeping everyone clothed and fed. In 1877, when Frank was 9, Hope was 7, and Daniel was 2, tragedy struck Columbia. A fire started in one of the saloons and quickly spread through the dry wooden buildings of the town. By the time it was contained, half of Main Street was gone, including the school where Helena had once taught. 3 people died in the blaze, and dozens more lost their homes and businesses. Fletcher and Helena opened their home to refugees from the fire, crowding families into every available space until more permanent housing could be arranged. For weeks, their cabin was chaos, filled with displaced neighbors and their possessions, but no one complained. Fletcher helped organize rebuilding efforts, using his carpentry skills to lead construction of new buildings. Helena coordinated food and supplies, making sure everyone had what they needed. It was during this time that Thomas Crawford reappeared in their lives. Now 22 and no longer the sullen boy Helena remembered, Thomas had become a steady young man with kind eyes and a quick mind. He'd left his father's claim years ago and had been working as a surveyor, mapping new territories. The fire had brought him back to Columbia to check on old friends, and he immediately pitched in to help with rebuilding. Thomas stayed for dinner one evening, entertaining Frank and Hope with stories of his surveying adventures while Daniel fell asleep in his lap. After the children were in bed, he, Fletcher, and Helena sat around the fire talking late into the night. "I never thanked you properly," Thomas said, looking between them, "for believing in me when no one else did, for showing me there was a different way to live than what my father showed me. I think about those lessons you taught, Mrs. James, not just reading and arithmetic, but about kindness and standing up for what's right. They shaped who I became." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. "We just gave you the tools, Thomas. You did the hard work yourself." "You gave me hope," he corrected gently. "That's worth more than you know." By autumn, Columbia had largely rebuilt. The new school was better than the old one, with more space and better equipment. The town had pulled together in the face of disaster, and in many ways, it emerged stronger than before. Thomas stayed through the reconstruction, and before he left to return to his surveying work, he made Helena promise to write and keep him updated on her family. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growth. The new house was finished when Frank was 12, a sprawling structure with room for the growing family and the many visitors who came to stay. Helena created a schoolroom where she taught not just her own children, but several other children from families living in the more remote mountain areas. Fletcher's furniture business thrived, his reputation for quality craftsmanship spreading throughout the region. Frank developed into a serious young man with his father's skill for working with wood and his mother's love of books. Hope showed a gift for music, learning to play her father's violin with natural talent that astounded them all. Daniel, the baby of the family, was the adventurer, always exploring, always getting into good-natured trouble. In 1882, when Frank was 16 and preparing to apprentice with a master carpenter in Sacramento, Thomas Crawford returned to the mountains. He'd done well for himself, now leading his own surveying team, and he came with a request. He'd met a young woman, the daughter of a rancher, and wanted to marry her. But before he could propose, he wanted Fletcher's blessing and Helena's advice on how to court her properly. They gave both freely, delighted to see the boy they'd once known grown into such a fine man. Thomas's wedding that winter was a joyous affair, and when he and his bride settled on a ranch 20 miles from Fletcher and Helena's home, it felt like family coming full circle. The 1880s brought changes to California and to their lives. The gold that had brought so many to Columbia was mostly played out, and the town's population began to decline as people moved on to new opportunities. But Fletcher and Helena stayed, their roots too deep to pull up now. Their children grew toward adulthood, each finding their own path. Frank became a master craftsman, eventually taking over much of the furniture business. Hope won a scholarship to study music in San Francisco, breaking her parents' hearts and making them proud in equal measure. Daniel, true to his adventurous nature, joined the forestry service, working to protect the mountains he loved. Through it all, Helena and Fletcher's love remained the foundation of everything. They still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still held hands during evening walks, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They'd built a life together that was rich and full, filled with love and purpose and meaning. In 1895, when Helena was 50 and Fletcher 53, they celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends. Frank was there with his wife and 2 children. Hope had come home from San Francisco with her husband, a violinist she'd met at conservatory. Daniel brought his new fiancée, a forestry worker as adventurous as he was. Thomas Crawford and his family attended, along with Sarah Chen and her husband, and dozens of other friends they'd gathered over the years. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Helena and Fletcher found themselves alone on the porch of the house he'd built, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd made their home. "Do you remember the day we met?" Fletcher asked, pulling Helena close against his side. "You were covered in mud and spitting mad that no one had helped you." "I remember you cleaned my hands so gently, I thought my heart might break from the kindness of it," Helena said. "I remember thinking you were the biggest man I'd ever seen and being terrified and fascinated in equal measure." "I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change," Fletcher admitted. "Knew I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Helena turned in his arms to look up at him. His hair was more gray than brown now, his face lined with years of sun and wind, but his eyes were the same forest green that had captivated her decades ago. "I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you since you picked me up out of that mud. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." Fletcher kissed her, soft and sweet, with all the tenderness of their first kiss and all the depth of 26 years of marriage. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "My Helena, my heart, my home." They stood there as the stars came out, holding each other as they'd done countless times before, grateful for every moment they'd been given, for the life they'd built together. The Wild West was fading into history, towns like Columbia settling into quieter existences as the frontier closed. But here, in these mountains, in this home they'd created, Helena and Fletcher had found something that would last longer than any gold rush or frontier boom. They'd found love, and in the end, that was the only treasure worth keeping. The years that followed were gentler, marked more by grandchildren's visits than great adventures. Helena's hair turned silver, and Fletcher's powerful frame settled into the solid strength of older age, but they remained vigorous and engaged with life. They watched their children thrive, saw their grandchildren born and grow, hosted gatherings that filled their home with laughter and love. On quiet evenings, they'd sit together on the porch they'd shared for so many years, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that never grew old. Fletcher would play his violin while Helena hummed along, or they'd simply sit in comfortable silence, hands clasped, needing no words to communicate what they felt. Their story had begun with a simple act of kindness, a mountain man stopping to help a woman who'd fallen in the mud when no one else would. It had grown into a love that weathered every storm, that deepened with every passing year, that created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. When Helena was 68 and Fletcher 71, he built her one final gift: a bench overlooking their favorite view of the mountains, carved with birds and flowers in the words, Helena's Haven. They'd sit there on sunny afternoons, Helena's head on Fletcher's shoulder, talking about everything they'd experienced together. "No regrets?" Fletcher asked her one such afternoon, as they watched clouds drift across an endless blue sky. "Not a single one," Helena said truthfully. "Well, maybe I regret that dress I ruined falling in the mud. It was my second best." Fletcher's laugh rumbled through his chest, warm and familiar. "I'll always be grateful for that mud puddle. Without it, I might never have worked up the courage to talk to you." "Oh, I think you would have," Helena said, squeezing his hand. "We were meant to find each other. The mud just hurried things along." They lived out their years in the mountains they loved, surrounded by family, never regretting the path they'd chosen. Helena passed peacefully in her sleep at 73, with Fletcher holding her hand as the sun rose over the Sierra Nevada. Fletcher followed her less than a year later, as though he couldn't bear to be apart from her for long. Their children buried them side by side on a hill overlooking their home, beneath towering pines that had watched over their love story from the beginning. On the shared headstone, their children had carved, "Fletcher and Helena James, 2 hearts, 1 love, eternal." And in the cabin that Fletcher had built and Helena had made a home, in the furniture that bore the marks of his skilled hands, in the books filled with her notes and thoughts, in the memories of everyone whose lives they'd touched, their love lived on. The mountain man who'd stopped to help a woman in need, and the teacher who'd seen past his rough exterior to the gentle heart beneath, had created something that transcended their individual lives. They'd proven that love, real and true and lasting, could flourish even in the hardest soil, even in the rough and tumble world of the Wild West. All it took was kindness, courage, and 2 people willing to build something beautiful together, one day at a time. Their great-grandchildren would visit that hill where they lay, bringing their own children to see where it all began. They'd tell the story of how Helena fell in the mud, and how Fletcher picked her up and cleaned her hands with such gentleness that she fell in love right then and there, even though she didn't know it yet. They'd talk about the life those 2 people built together, the love that sustained them through joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. And in the telling and retelling, the story would take on the quality of legend, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. That a man stopping to help a stranger in distress can change not just 2 lives, but generations to come. That love, when nurtured and cherished, when built on mutual respect and genuine partnership, can create something that echoes through time. The mountains stood eternal witness to all of it, the peaks and valleys holding the memory of every laugh, every tear, every whispered word of love between Helena and Fletcher. And if you visited that place on a quiet evening, when the light slanted gold through the pines and the air smelled of sap and wildflowers, you might almost hear the echo of a violin playing, a woman's soft laughter, and the sound of 2 voices blending in harmony, proof that some loves truly are forever.